I bought a forest behind an HOA and found out they'd been trespassing on it for 15 years. If you love watching entitled HOAs get exactly what they deserve, subscribe now. This one gets way more satisfying than you'd expect. I bought 40 acres of worthless forest behind an HOA neighborhood. Within a week, I had 3 lawyers threatening me, an anonymous note nailed to my gate, and 200 angry homeowners who suddenly acted like the land had always belonged to them. It didn't. It belonged to me, and they'd been trespassing on it for 15 years. If HOA-powered trips and petty tyrants getting exactly what they deserve is your thing, subscribe now. Because this story ends with me locking a gate that changed an entire neighborhood forever. The land had been sitting untouched for over a decade. Steep terrain, no road access, nothing but trees and a creek running through the middle. The county listed it for almost nothing because nobody wanted to deal with the headache of developing it. I wasn't planning to develop it. I just wanted quiet land to build a small cabin on, somewhere to disappear on weekends, somewhere nobody would bother me. I had no idea I was about to become the most hated man in an entire HOA community. The moment I signed the paperwork, I drove out to walk the property line for the first time as the legal owner. That's when I noticed something strange. Trails, actual maintained trails, cut clean through my forest, with chip pathways, a little wooden bridge crossing the creek, small signs nailed to trees that read Trail 3, Ridge Loop, and Trail 5, Creek Crossing. Someone had built an entire trail system on my land without asking anyone. I followed the main trail for almost half a mile before it opened up into a clearing with a bench, a small fire pit, and, I kid you not, a laminated map bolted to a wooden post. The map showed the entire trail network stretching across what was now legally my property. At the bottom of the map, in bold letters, maintained by Ridgeview Estates HOA Trail Committee. I stood there staring at it, half amused, half furious. This wasn't some accidental overlap. This was an entire organized system built and maintained by an HOA that didn't own a single acre of this land. I pulled out my phone and called the county assessor's office just to confirm what I already suspected. The land had been privately owned, vacant, untouched, absolutely nothing to do with the neighborhood. For the entire 15 years these trails had apparently existed. The HOA had simply taken it, built infrastructure on land they never owned, never leased, and never had permission to use. And from where on those trails, hundreds of people had been walking, biking, and letting their dogs run through what was legally my private property for over a decade. I drove home that night with a plan already forming. If they wanted to treat my land like a public park, I was going to remind them exactly whose name was on the deed. The next morning, I ordered a locked gate for the main trailhead, the one closest to the neighborhood entrance. I figured a fence and a few private property, no trespassing signs would end things quietly. I had no idea how wrong I was, because the moment that gate went up, my phone started ringing. Not from confused neighbors, from the HOA board president herself, sounding less like someone who'd made an honest mistake, and a lot more like someone who considered those trails theirs to lose. "You need to take that gate down immediately," she said, voice sharp and clipped. "Those trails have been part of this community for 15 years. They've been part of my land for 15 years. I corrected her. Illegally. There was a long pause. The kind of pause that tells you the person on the other end already knows they're wrong and is deciding exactly how far they're willing to go to pretend otherwise. "You have no idea what you just started," she finally said. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence wasn't a threat. It was a promise. She hung up before I could respond, and within an hour, I understood exactly what she meant. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A photo. My own gate, the one I'd installed that morning, with a chain wrapped around it and a padlock that wasn't mine. Someone had already tried to force it open. I drove out to the property immediately, adrenaline pumping, half expecting to find the gate destroyed. Instead, I found something almost more unsettling. The gate was intact, but zip-tied to the fence post beside it was a laminated notice printed on official-looking letterhead. Notice of easement, Ridgeview Estates HOA. Trail access has been established through prescriptive use. Removal of this access point may result in legal action. Prescriptive easement. I'd heard the term before, but I wasn't a lawyer, so I did what anyone would do. I called one. My attorney, a sharp older woman named Linda who'd handled property disputes for over 20 years, laughed the second I finished explaining. A prescriptive easement requires open, continuous, and uncontested use for a legal period. Usually with the landowner's knowledge, she said. The previous owner didn't know about these trails. There's no record of him ever granting access, and county records show the land was listed as vacant and used and unmaintained for the entire period they claim they've been using it. In other words, the HOA didn't have a legal leg to stand on. They'd simply used land that wasn't theirs long enough that they started believing it was. But belief and law are two very different things. They might still try to intimidate you into backing down, Linda warned. People don't like losing things they've convinced themselves they're entitled to. She had no idea how right she was. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from an HOA attorney threatening legal action if I didn't reopen public trail access within 30 days. Attached was a petition, nearly 200 signatures from neighborhood residents, all demanding the trails remain open. 200 signatures. For land they'd never owned. Access they'd never had rights to. Trails they'd built without a single conversation with the actual property owner. I felt something shift in me reading that letter. This wasn't about hiking paths anymore. This was about an entire community believing that convenience and habit gave them ownership rights over someone else's private property. I wasn't backing down. If anything, that letter made my decision easier. I called a fencing company and ordered materials for the entire perimeter, not just the main trailhead, but every single access point the HOA had cut into my property line. 5 trailheads, 5 locked gates, no exceptions. When the fencing crew showed up 3 days later to start the installation, I wasn't prepared for what was waiting for us at the first trailhead. A crowd. At least 30 homeowners, some holding coffee mugs like they'd walked straight from their kitchens, others holding handwritten signs. Standing directly in front of the trail entrance, blocking the fencing crew from even reaching the property line. At the front of the crowd stood the HOA board president, arms crossed, a satisfied smile on her face like she'd already won. "You really thought we'd just let you close this?" she called out as I stepped out of my truck. I looked at the crowd. Then, at the trail behind them, cutting through my land, marked with signs paid for by an association that had never once asked permission. "I don't need you to let me do anything," I said calmly. "I own this." The crowd went dead silent, because in that moment they realized I wasn't the pushover landowner they'd expected. I was the first person in 15 years who was actually going to make them face the truth about what they'd built. The crowd didn't move. 30 pairs of eyes, all locked on me, like I was the villain in a story they'd already written in their heads. "This is community land," a man near the front shouted. "Our kids have grown up walking these trails." "Your kids grew up trespassing," I said. "That's not the same thing." A woman gasped like I'd said something unforgivable. The HOA president stepped forward, chin raised, clearly the self-appointed spokesperson for this entire performance. "We've maintained this trail system for 15 years, she said, loud enough for everyone behind her to hear. "Cleared brush, built bridges, installed signage. That's not nothing." "You're right," I said. "It's not nothing. It's 15 years of unauthorized construction on private property, which legally makes every improvement you just listed mine now." That landed harder than I expected. A few people in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. The president's confident expression flickered just for a second before she rebuilt it. "We'll see what a judge says about that," she snapped. "We will," I said, "but until then, my fencing crew has a job to do." I turned to the crew lead, nodded, and gestured toward the trailhead. For a moment, nobody moved, not the crew, not the crowd, just a standoff of pure tension, 30 homeowners against 5 fence installers and 1 landowner who refused to blink. Then something happened I didn't expect. An older man near the back of the crowd, quiet, arms folded, clearly less emotionally invested than the others, spoke up. She's not wrong, he said, looking at the president. We never had permission. I remember when the trails first went in. Nobody ever asked who owned this land. The crowd turned toward him like he'd committed treason. That's not the point, Gary, the president snapped. It's exactly the point, Gary said. We built something on land that wasn't ours and just hoped nobody would notice. That's not community spirit. That's just trespassing with extra steps. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, cracks forming in what had looked like a united front just moments ago. I could see it now. Not everyone here actually believed they had a right to this land. Some had just gone along with the group, the same way people go along with an HOA rule they secretly think is ridiculous because pushing back feels harder than staying quiet. The president, sensing the shift, tried to regain control. This isn't up for debate, she said sharply. The board has already authorized legal action if this fence goes up today. Then I guess we'll see you in court, I said, nodding toward the crew again. This time they moved. The first post went into the ground. The first section of fencing rose along the trailhead, and as the metallic clank of tools echoed across that clearing, something shifted in the crowd's energy, not louder, but heavier, like they were finally starting to understand this wasn't a bluff. That's when my phone rang. Unknown number again. I almost didn't answer it, but something told me I should. Is this the owner of the Ridgeview Forest parcel? A man's voice asked, calm and official. Speaking, I said, "This is County Code Enforcement," he said. "We received a report of unpermitted structures on your property, bridges, benches, signage. We'd like to schedule an inspection." I nearly laughed. The HOA had been so desperate to stop my fence, they'd apparently called the county on themselves without realizing what they were actually reporting. Every unpermitted structure, every illegally built bridge, every trail marker nailed into a tree without permission. All of it about to be investigated, and all of it sitting on land that belonged entirely to me. The county inspector's words hung in the air long after I hung up the phone. Unpermitted structures, on my land, reported by the very people who built them. I almost felt bad for the HOA board. Almost. 3 days later, a white county vehicle pulled up to the same trailhead where the fencing crew had finished installing gate number 1. 2 inspectors stepped out with clipboards, cameras, and exactly zero patience for excuses. I met them at the gate, unlocked it, and walked them onto my property myself. What followed was almost satisfying to watch. The wooden bridge crossing the creek, built without a permit, without an engineer's inspection, without any regard for erosion control regulations. Non-compliant. The fire pit in the clearing, built dangerously close to dry brush, violating multiple county fire code regulations. Non-compliant. Even the trail signage itself nailed directly into protected tree species without authorization. Non-compliant, again. By the time the inspectors finished walking the full trail system, they documented 11 separate violations, all constructed by the HOA, all without permits, all now legally my responsibility to either bring up to code or remove entirely. I chose to remove them, not because I had to, because I wanted to. Every bridge, bench, fire pit, and sign came down within the week. The very infrastructure the HOA had proudly maintained for 15 years disappeared like it had never existed, hauled away by a crew I hired specifically for the job. The HOA's legal threats, meanwhile, quietly disappeared too. Their attorney sent one final letter, not demanding access this time, but asking if we could explore a formal easement agreement. Translation: they finally realized they had absolutely zero legal standing, and were hoping I'd let them save face with an official agreement instead of nothing at all. I said no, not out of spite, out of principle. 15 years of trespassing, intimidation, threats, and public shaming didn't exactly inspire me to hand them a formal, permanent right to my land. Instead, I built my cabin exactly where I always wanted it, quiet, private, surrounded by forests that finally truly felt like mine. No trails cutting through my privacy. No strangers walking past my windows. No HOA committee treating my property like a shared amenity they never paid for. A few months later, I ran into Gary, the older man who'd spoken up that day at the trailhead, buying coffee in town. "Community's a lot quieter now," he said with a small smile. "Turns out people can survive without a shortcut through someone else's backyard." I laughed. He wasn't wrong. The HOA board president who'd once told me, "You have no idea what you just started," was voted off the board in the next election. Turns out, when residents realized their leadership had exposed the entire neighborhood to code violations and legal liability just to avoid admitting a mistake, trust didn't exactly hold strong. As for me, I still walk those woods every single day. Quiet, untouched, exactly the way I bought it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't yelling louder or fighting harder. It's simply refusing to let someone else's 15 years of convenience outweigh your one legal truth. This land was always mine. It just took closing every illegal trail for everyone else to finally believe it too. If this story hit the way it hit me telling it, make sure you're subscribed, because the next HOA story I bring you might be even more unbelievable than this one.